Welcome back to the Bonsai Builders Podcast. I'm your host, Addison Galambos. This week we've got part 2 of the super fun conversation with Jonas and Eric. Really appreciate both of them for coming on the show again. Getting the chance to sit down with two veterans in the kind of agriculture and horticultural space was a real treat, and I feel like there's a lot of really kind of aha moments buried in this episode, so I hope you enjoy. If you have been liking the podcast, it would mean a lot to me if you could follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're using. It really helps get the show in front of more people and helps it grow. So thank you all, and let's jump into the episode. Moving over to the horticulture and agriculture standpoint, Eric, I know you didn't want to label yourself, you had trouble imagining yourself as a pro here, but you definitely are a pro, and you're operating, at scale at a growing nursery. And I've really appreciated the approach you're taking to kind of looking at agricultural and horticultural research and kind of bringing that to your own process. I guess maybe I'll start with should bonsai practitioners be kind of directly utilizing research in kind of related disciplines within their bonsai process? And how do you do that safely?
I think it's really easy to overcomplicate things. And the whole concept of plant nutrition is super complicated. The relationship of the plant to the water, to the soil particles, all of that sort of stuff. And I think in a sense, what we need in the bonsai community is a distilled basic understanding of what it is that the plants need and how to deliver it. And so, all of that research that was done in the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, basically established, what are the elements that make up plant tissue? They would literally take plant tissue, dry it out, and then break it up into elements and measure the percentage by weight of nitrogen and the percentage by weight of carbon and the percentage by weight. So all of these things were sort of ironed out. And so those experiments where you're looking at the basics of this were done quite a while ago compared to, from our perspective. This is not edgy in terms of science or anything like that. And I think that's why it doesn't really get a lot of coverage. The agriculture industry really knows, okay, this is what you have to do. And that's not going to change. The basic elements that have to be delivered to plants is not going to change just because we start talking about it a little bit differently. As far as the crossover with bonsai, I just think that if you could get me to sit here and talk for hours about the interrelationships of all of these things, but when we go beyond the three of us talking about it, we need to have what I would like to see is a shorthand, sort of a understanding that we can give to all of our students, that we can give to all of your listeners, that is common. Because from my perspective, there shouldn't be a lot of controversy. There shouldn't be any real question about what the plants need.
That makes sense. I think it's tough sometimes, even just me trying to dive into agricultural textbooks, you see the 17 essential elements, you see the 15 essential elements. So there's some amount of disagreement on some of the micronutrients and things like that, or it's not consistent at least. But
that's an argument among scientists.
Things are all.
That's not something bonsai practitioners experience. That's something that academics debate. And that's why my starting point is always, do you have a known health problem with your trees that's not explained by pest or disease?
Got it.
Or just plain under fertilization. And then you can start the conversation. I've seen a lot of people dive into some crazy depth and or create more problems when I'm not totally sure they were clear what the problem was in the first place. And so, at the researcher level, there's all kinds of great debatable stuff. And the number of essential nutrients is definitely one of them. But I don't know that that's going to be germane to your average juniper grower who might be keeping a tree indoors.
Yeah, I guess as I think of it, yeah, exactly. Or just not living, trying to grow a tree in a climate it doesn't grow in, or exactly. It's probably not, a lack of copper while your redwood died. It's probably because it was 10 degrees out and, but yeah.
The main reason trees die are because people leave town for the weekend. That's why most bonsai die, period.
Yeah. So, okay. So I guess, how would you recommend people find the kind of basic knowledge? I mean, you talked about kind of like creating a handout or something like that, but like where would you generate the knowledge for that handout from? You had shared some links with me, which were awesome, but I'm just curious, like, how would you describe those resources to people for like, hey, I want to get the basic horticultural knowledge on like, you know, and like, what is that basic horticultural knowledge that people need?
If you want to dive into fertilizer, more power to you. You know, I don't want to, you know, short anybody on their interest. And those resources would probably be best if you just provide the links to the listeners. I can certainly do the same at some future point. You know, there are forestry resources. Basically, our best analogy in terms of growing trees in containers is forestry seedlings. And it's pretty well established. You can see that, like, if there's not enough nitrogen, then you get, you know, yellowing in the seedlings, or if there's not enough, I'm not going to get the symptoms wrong, but basically there's a correlation between visible symptoms in some cases. And so we can rely on that type of literature in terms of being a resource for understanding what the trees need, because it's pretty widespread and it comes from that earlier 20th century, more theoretical exploration of plant needs. So I think that the other thing you can dive into is what is actually on the back of your fertilizer label. So most fertilizers are going to have a analysis on them. The Japanese ones don't seem to have it, but in the US at least, they're going to have some sort of analysis on them. And so just like what you guys were talking about in your water episodes, I think there's a defined, well, we could talk about the ratio of the elements to each other, because that's one aspect of it. We could talk about the difficulty that some of the, you know, that plants have in absorbing some nutrients versus others, and the conditions that you need to provide for those. I think that's very important for people to understand, but I don't think there's an easy button, if that's what you're asking for.
Do we actually have problems? Do general gardening guides or bonsai books not provide adequate information for almost everybody? Like, are there a lot of problems caused by them giving a little bit too much of this micronutrient or a little bit not enough of that? Like, this is just in general not a problem I've seen over the years.
Well, I would say that there are some problems that are somewhat specific to bonsai, not entirely exclusively, but Addison was asking the question, what makes good water and what makes bad water? And you guys talked about that quite a bit. I think when I was done listening to that episode, my takeaway was that you had actually missed the first thing in my mind that makes bad or good water, and that is how many parts per million of sodium are in it. So unfortunately, most of the city reports that you guys were talking about don't really track sodium content separately from overall TDS. And the calcium carbonate that you were talking about is actually a plant nutrient. So that being in the water by itself isn't a problem. But the calcium ratio to the magnesium, as you discussed, is potentially a problem. So serpentine soils are, I think it's 3-to-1 magnesium to calcium, and nothing will grow in them. Whereas the standard ratio is 3-to-1 calcium to magnesium. That's what almost every plant wants. So
how does the average person make any of what you just said relevant? And that's where I keep coming back to is anyone who feeds their trees regularly the basic advice that you're not giving them too strong a readout? Are there, like, it's more, I always think of it in terms of what do you look for that leads you down that rabbit hole? Obviously, you can research it if it's interesting. That's great. That's science. Science is fun. And so, but if you're worrying about calcium and magnesium ratios, what am I seeing in my tree that makes me think to do that? And I think that's exactly right about the sodium. I think the number one problem with fertilizer is most people just don't use enough of it. And something related to fertilizer problems is a lot of people have a lot of sodium in their water and they go to great lengths. Eric said this really well once, and I think it encapsulates everything. Is if you learn one thing about water, it might be pH. Oh, high pH bad, lower pH better. And then you realize you can correct that. But if you learn two things about water, you realize, oh, some nutrients might need it high, some might need it low. Then you learn three things about water and you might add on to that. And so we've been looking at all these questions for years now, and I don't know if we're on 23 or 32, but as soon as you learn one more thing, it puts a whole lot of that other stuff in a different light.
Totally. It makes it, you get one layer deeper and you're like, well, shit, I don't know anything actually. Like now I have to rethink those assumptions. Which makes it really tough. Yeah.
Well, does it make it really tough, or does it mean we're just not very focused on what problem we're trying to solve? When I was working on the last book, I took a month off and did nothing but read contemporary research on fertilizer for a month. And I realized as a result of that I could make precisely 0 claims that would be helpful for people. So instead, I wrote an entire chapter about signs that you're not fertilizing enough, signs that you might be fertilizing too much, signs your water might be awful, signs your water might be fine. If you don't know you have any problems, there's no reason to listen to any of this. If your trees are giving you what you want, and a lot of people around the country are, but the more I travel, the more I see people that just aren't fertilizing enough, or they just don't keep on top of their trees. Those are the biggest problems. And then those poor customers in places like Arizona, Southern California, that just have a ton of sodium in the water, eliminating that sodium is the only, or limiting what species you grow are the only actual things that really radically move the needle.
Well, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. Well, a few things I want to say on this. One is like, I agree philosophically with what you were sharing, Eric, about essentially like keep it simple, KISS, right? Keep it simple, stupid, sweetie. Like, and I think this was mirrored by you, Jonas, in that like there are basic, I'll say worked out in air quotes things where it's like, yes, you should apply fertilizers, and these fertilizers have been used for decades and they have the same components, and like, you should water your tree. Like there's these basic things that we should be doing to keep our plants healthy. And in most cases, those work fine, right? And my experience, at least with like, for example, saltwater reef tanks, is that as soon as you start trying to like micro control the environment and like you're trying to really, really control biological systems, they're so complex that you're going to get it wrong. And the living things are going to respond less well to rapid changes and like these really big swings than they will to just leaving them alone and letting them sort it out themselves. Like living things want to live. And so, if you keep it simple, they can often self-correct over time, right? And so in general, that's my philosophy with my collection. And I have a lot of success, relatively, I feel like, with my collection. So I think the follow on to that though, is that like people start to look for that next degree of detail whenever things aren't going right? So it's like, I think in general, if your trees are growing healthy, then, keep doing what you're doing, right? And I agree with that, Jonas. But I think sometimes something doesn't go right. And then to me, one of the things that doesn't go right is water. And so that's what led me into looking into like, how can you determine if tap water is the problem or not for your collection? And so that was like what led me down that path of research and trying to answer the question of what's good water, what's bad water. So that if people if their collection isn't healthy, like how do they rule out whether the water is the cause of their issue or not, right? I guess that's like why I think it's important to look into the science, because sometimes things don't go right. And then you have a question about like, why aren't they going right? Right.
Yeah. And I put a whole chapter in the book to help people troubleshoot that. Like that was the conclusion I came to, is if you can't explain a given problem, how do you start troubleshooting that kind of stuff? And it starts very, very simple. It doesn't need to go crazy right away. And usually there's a fairly obvious culprit sooner rather than later. And then it's a matter of how much energy you're going to put into addressing it.
So then, Addison, would it be productive for us to actually just do like from start to finish sort of, if you're having trouble with your plant, what would the best steps be?
Yeah, and who are these people that have these problems that you're talking about? Because we're all blessed with insanely good water around here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I just heard of like, I just have a lot of experience with saltwater tanks with like using RO systems and just like testing water parameters. So it was just like just an interesting topic to me, right? I don't do anything to my water in San Francisco because, I guess anecdotally I put it into the good category, right? But yeah.
So, the crossover between water chemistry or, your water source and your fertilizer is real. And you guys talked a little bit about CalMag. And with really clean water, one of the problems is that the calcium magnesium content may be so low that the plants aren't actually getting very much from the water. And the crossover problem is that many fertilizers don't contain calcium and magnesium because the minerals that would be used to provide that will actually react with the other chemicals that are in the fertilizer when you put it in solution. And so you get like white, crusty little flakes in the bottom of your fertilizer bucket instead of happy plants. I think that, troubleshooting, I don't know, I have like this great amount of compassion. Maybe I should just share the story. I moved from San Francisco to Thousand Oaks in Ventura County, Southern California, and went from ideal water at one point to a TDS that was about 500 or 600. And at the time, even though I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry, I wasn't really thinking about this. I wasn't thinking, well, this water chemistry is going to be a problem. No, what I did was I took my plants down there, and within a couple of weeks, they basically all stopped growing. And I was like, well, what's the difference here? And so I started looking into it, just like what you're talking about, and found that, there's all these excess salts in this water, and the salts that are in there are not in the right mixture, right? So there's too much of one salt, or there's too little of another, and so how do you reset that? And the basic answer is you can't pull those salts out of the water with any ease. Like people always ask me, well, why don't you just use a carbon filter or something like that? And none of that works, right? The only thing that really works is what you said, either deionization or reverse osmosis. And reverse osmosis systems are out there. They've been used in hydroponics. So the next step that I took was to go and just take all of the minerals out of the water and then start watering my plants. And all of a sudden they went from being like this sort of like locked up, not growing sort of look to them to taking off. And I was like, oh, this is fantastic. And then about 3 weeks later, they stopped. And I was like, oh, nuts. I know the guy at the hydro store told me something else that I had to do to this, but I don't remember what it was. So I went back to the hydro store and I said, okay, so this is my problem. And he said, you should be using a CalMag solution. So that CalMag solution probably also had iron. Maybe it even had a full suite of micronutrients in it. But you basically, in the end, I started using Dynagrow because it had some nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, and it also had the right proportions of all those micronutrients, interestingly, including sodium. So it's so complicated that I actually wrote to Dynagrow and said, why is there sodium in this? And they said, well, the best science basically says that the presence of sodium enhances the absorption of some of the other elements, but it has to be in precisely the right ratio in order for that to happen. So anyways, I'm basically taking the RO water and adding, I believe it was remineralizing it with the correct ratio of, which is from a fertilizer, right? But it was a complete fertilizer. And then once I did that, my trees were very, very happy because it was, 80 to 90 degrees for much of the year. They had a perfect nutrient ratio in the water. This was across many different types of, well, I shouldn't say many, a significant number of soil mixes. I don't think I was using perlite at the time, but in the end, a lot of what we do is very much like hydroponics, and the water chemistry has a big effect on the plants over time. And, but that simple solution of basically saying, I guess you have to verify that the fertilizer actually is complete. But if you live in Southern California, once you suck out all of the salts from your water and then redose it with the appropriate chemicals or minerals, however you want to say it, you should be good to go. And you shouldn't really need to think about this a whole lot.
Makes sense. Okay. So there was a lot of things you said in there. I guess first thing I wanted to grasp was in the kind of piece before this, you had said, you listened to our previous water episodes, and I definitely wanted to really pull out those insights of like the checking us, other Eric and I, on some of the things we said. So, we did talk a lot about alkalinity as well as calcium carbonate content essentially, right? Saying like, hey, high TDS water is bad, low TDS water is good. What is it in high TDS water? And we were saying calcium carbonate is like, there's a lot of calcium carbonate. And so eventually too much calcium carbonate. But I think you were saying that potentially the actual source of that additional TDS, that additional stuff in those additional salts in the water is actually sodium, maybe like salt water, right? A sodium chloride, I'm assuming, or something like that. But so you're thinking that the danger of high TDS water is potentially just, salt in the form of salt?
Literally table salt. And it's sodium.
Okay.
So sodium competes with potassium. They're, if you look at a periodic table, they're in the same column, so they're chemically very similar. So sodium competes with potassium. So not only is it basically preventing the plant from taking up potassium, it has a very strong electrical presence in solution. And so it's basically kind of throwing everything else off once it gets past a certain threshold. I spent a lot of time looking for that threshold, and basically through literature found that if you have roughly 25 parts per million of sodium or higher, your plants are in trouble.
Really?
Now, if you have 24 and you're fine, and you have 26 and you're not fine, obviously it's a range.
And it's species by species.
And it's species by species. And, obviously some plants grow in saltwater. So in general, when we're talking about growing bonsai, if you have more than 25 parts per million of sodium in your water, you're probably going to need to mitigate it.
That's really interesting. I really appreciate you bringing that up. So to me, luckily, like if there's high sodium, there's probably going to be high calcium carbonate as well, right? So they're probably correlated in some sense if it's coming from the ground and there's salt in the ground, and that's where you're getting your calcium carbonate. So I think serendipitously, I guess, from the episode's perspective, the solution, just like you found in your scenario, is to like strip the minerals from the water, right? And so you used reverse osmosis in your case, and then remineralize the water afterwards with the kind of good mix of components that you needed, right? And then that led to good outcomes for your plants.
Yeah. And, adjusting ratios of nutrients will give you different effects. I would say it's really just maybe the ratio of nitrogen to the rest of everything else. If you drop the nitrogen, you can kind of like not push as, much growth, but still keep the plant healthy. But plants need nitrogen, and nitrogen is one of those things that moves around really quickly, both in the environment and in plant tissue. So the minute you stop providing it, the plant is going to start going into nitrogen deficiency. So it's a matter of applying it at the correct rate to get what you want. And students will ask me, like, should I just fertilize everything? And I have this weird exception where I tell people not to fertilize Japanese maples in spring because the nodes will get too long. Well, nodes get too long in other things as well, but it seems like it's worse in Japanese maples, and they don't go into chlorosis as far as I can tell. So there's no one size fits all, but I do think that getting rid of the problem with sodium by using RO and using a balanced fertilizer is going to take care of just so many problems.
Got it.
It's just going to avoid them.
That's the basic prescription. And then whether you need to use RO or not depends on your kind of situation, right?
But the ions...
You could add... Well, go ahead, sorry.
The mix of ions is going to be different for everybody, right? So...
You mean in their tap water?
Right. So if you have well water and you're in Sonoma County, you have a very different mix of ions than if you have municipal water and you're in Ventura County. So I used to go up to Jim's Gremmel's place, who was in Sonoma County, and he had a lot of iron. And I think that there was also a couple of other excess ions in there. So ions in excess, in basically as soon as you get the ratios off, it can be a problem. Is it going to be a problem and your plant's going to stop growing, or is it going to be a problem long-term? You just don't get maybe ideal growth. You have to kind of judge that for yourself, but you shouldn't assume that it's either good or bad. There's so many, it's so complex, as you say, with biological systems, that every water source, it kind of needs to be evaluated differently. And that's why you see that water quality reports are all different. Even if so in the East Bay, we have the geology drives higher sodium content in groundwater than what would normally be usable. And so Jonas gets his water from East Bay mud and I get my water from East Bay mud, but my water has, I think it's 23 parts per million of sodium and his has like 3. Those are basically because they come from 2 different processing plants within the same utility. And those 2 processing plants are getting the water from 2 different sources. Mine comes from a mix of the Sierra Nevada and local water, and his is, I think, almost exclusively from the Sierra Nevada. So the geology in the Sierra Nevada is not the same, and it doesn't create or it doesn't release sodium ions into the water the same way that the local geology does.
Yeah, I mean, and the level of sodium that you're saying is problematic, like 25 ppm. That's not a lot of sodium. So that just makes me think, like, if that's not called out super specifically in a water report, or just like it changes throughout the season as well. So I think that sounds like a parameter that folks should be testing. And then, I mean, it sounds like you're almost advocating that RO water should be more prevalent amongst bonsai hobbyists.
No.
Like, no, you're not.
No, I'm not. Actually, I think that most people...
Well, then how do you optimize... If you're saying that somewhat, like, there's this spectrum of, like, or, like, water's not always good or bad. You have to balance it with your fertilizer. But, like, we're not, like, prescribing different fertilizers for different water, are we, right? Like, everybody's just using the same thing, right? So it seems like then you would have to control your water, right? Unless you're saying that we should be trying to figure out which best fertilizer for our water we should be using to, like, make it good, even if it's quote unquote bad water by my definition or somebody's definition.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that California, Arizona, New Mexico, like basically the Southwest United States, is very different than the Pacific Northwest, very different than, you know, the Midwest and the East Coast, both because of the precipitation, the amount of precipitation and when the precipitation comes, but also because of the geology. So these things. So I think the general rule is that if you're in California, probably also Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, you probably need to pay attention to your water source and be kind of careful about it. I think in the rest of the country, that's not really the case. Maybe I'll add Utah to the list. I don't know about Colorado, but you don't.
Now we're getting complicated. Jonas is smiling. He's like, all right, here we're back in it.
I don't want to advocate too simple of a procedure, but like the bottom line is that most people's tap water is usable for bonsai, but we all are in California, and most people in California, their tap water is not that great for bonsai.
Got it. Okay.
So in the core Bay area, the East Bay mud is fine, and the San Francisco water source is fine, except if you live in the Presidio. And that water source goes all the way down the peninsula to about Palo Alto, at which point it starts getting mixed in with the San Jose source, which is not great. So if you live in the San Jose area, most likely you need to treat your water by RO and redosing it with minerals. So, there's just no generalization there. But in terms of if everybody should use RO, no, it's expensive. It's frustrating to use. You need a pump, you need a tank. If your water is fine, don't use RO.
It gets back to that simple concept of find out what's actually going on. Look at your water and then see what about it might be wacko. It's not as easy as just changing the pH or just doing RO, as no one will tell you there's anything easy about that. But there's a whole lot of other strategies to try that. Say you have a bunch of sodium in the water. Well, it might be a little bit too high. Some people save rainwater, and if they just mix their rainwater with their municipal water, say 50-50, that cuts the sodium down in half. That might be enough to get it down to a more reasonable threshold. Some people do RO and add some of the original water back in. That's another way to run it down. The biggest part of the country and the most overall human beings doing bonsai in the country, they get rain all year long. They don't know what we're talking about with this crazy summer drought. They are getting fantastic water through the rain all season long, and that goes a huge way towards mitigating a lot of the water-based problems. They have more interesting problems in terms of whether or not they're delivering fertilizer via liquid or solids based on whether or not they turned on their hose in a given week or month, depending on how wet that month happened to be, or how long their growing seasons are. That's another big complicating factor. And so maybe a filter is an alternative to RO, maybe blending it or using rainwater. So or just some plants you find out need it and some others. So there's a lot of approaches that stop a lot short of the RO. The other way to look at it is, let's say you've gone nuclear and you have gone RO, or kind of like what I do in my garden. I realize that I essentially have RO water out of the tap, and it took me about 20 years to realize that. Several years ago, I studied water reports from all over the country, and so I got a much better idea about what kinds of problems which regions happened. I wrote that up for the book too, because I needed to know, hey, how do you give advice for people in all kinds of different situations? And what I found is, depending on the species you grow and the stages of development, you might have very different needs to fertilize differently. You may not want to hammer deciduous trees in spring. You may not want to hammer pines after decandling. And so I've come up with different rubrics for what my baseline strategy is of water that I want to add to my essentially RO water that comes out of the tap. And then I can supplement with either occasional liquid fertilizings or solid fertilizers. And what's funny is, for me, the bellwether is my baseline fertilizer is how much can I add before California or Sierra junipers turn juvenile, because they're actually incredibly sensitive to just tiny amounts of fertilizer. And I find that if I'm delivering between 60 and 80 parts per million of total fertilizer, around that point, I'm going to start seeing juvenile growth in those junipers. So if I go much higher than that, like up to 120, and that's just total fertilizer, then I know that those are going to go juvenile. So I try to keep it a little bit below that. And then on top of that, I can supplement whatever species need more. Now, do I actually do that? There's that. We'll get into that too. That's actually a much bigger problem of who goes to the effort of giving every tree what it needs in the garden.
I guess that's an optimization problem too, as opposed to like a general health problem.
That's kind of my point, is the general things are all pretty straightforward. It's only when you identify, I must be over fertilizing my deciduous trees because in spring I have these unruly things, or
really long
maybe I fertilize so heavily in fall they explode in spring, and so it's another form of fertilizer problem that most people ignore.
This is super helpful. I'm curious. Well, go ahead, Eric.
Well, I really like that you're curious about it, and I was going to say that I think that being curious about it is the best way to figure out the solution. Because the solution is not going to be the same for everybody, you actually have to get into these things. And so it is productive for us to talk about it. And, it's easy to, with 25 years of growing under your belt, to say, this is not a big deal. But when you're a beginner and you something's going wrong with your tree, you really want to get in there and think about it. But it does take some curiosity and some sticking with it to really figure out, okay, what's happening with my plant and how could I potentially solve this? Now, you mentioned that you're using, I thought it was Miracle-Gro, but I'm not sure. So I'll just mention that one of the classic fertilizer regimens was like alternating weekly Miracle-Gro with fish emulsion. And I think that's worked reasonably well. I don't know what the calcium content of fish emulsion is, but I do know that Miracle-Gro is, the regular Miracle-Gro is aimed more at flower and vegetable gardening than it is at tree and shrub kind of stuff. So there's different ratios in there and different sources of certain things that are maybe not completely optimal for tree species in containers. Interestingly, just a week ago, I realized that Miracle-Gro Shake and Feed, which is basically like an Osmocote product, actually has the correct ratios and has the CalMag in it. Because there's no problem with it being in solution, they can add the CalMag in there. So that's not an endorsement of that product, but what it means is that you should be paying attention and making sure that everything is there that the plants need.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. One thing, well, first of all, this has been really, really helpful. I really appreciate all the kind of expertise you're bringing. I wanted to get a short list from you guys on like what parameters do you recommend people test or look at for their water? Like if you were making a list of the top, tell me how many things you think they should. And then like, let's say it's the top 3. Like what do you think are the things that people should be aware of as far as water parameters for their water?
I think the number one thing is there sodium in the water and how many parts per million? So some of your utilities are going to tell you that, some aren't. But if you call them up like you guys were talking about, I've talked to my utility people and asked them a few more specific questions, and they were very helpful. But I would say if it comes down to that one thing, it's not the only problem, but it's the most common one in California and the Southwest United States, and it has the biggest impact. So look into it.
Checking in with other people that grow bonsai in your area. If your trees are healthy and your peers' trees are healthy, there might be a lot of other things you could be studying. And so that's going to apply to big swaths of the country that have pretty good water.
That makes sense. Yeah, if nobody else is using RO water in your area and they're using the same tap water and their trees are healthy and yours aren't, then it's probably not water. I think that's a good, common sense.
I was really surprised how many pockets of the country actually have decent water. There are utilities from Seattle to Kentucky that have 80 parts per million total, and it was a decent mix of things with sodium in the 12 range. And I actually thought we were unique in how nice our water was, but no, there's great water here and there in many parts of the country. It doesn't mean everyone has it, but it was a lot more than I had suspected, and it was a lot more geographically diverse.
The other thing I wanted to ask you both about water is pH. I know, Jonas, you've written blogs that I've read about acidification in the past, so I'm curious on both of your thoughts on pH. Should we be messing with it? Should we not be messing with it? Should alkalinity play a factor in whether or not we mess with it? Curious your thoughts on that.
I think Eric has some really good talking points on this one.
Oh boy. I think that the pH, so pH matters in terms of nutrient uptake and the mix of nutrients that the plant uptakes, but I don't think it's the most important thing that people should be paying attention to. And in certain situations, you're going to have to pay attention to your pH, particularly like you said, Addison, if you have a very high TDS water and the pH is also very high, then you should be getting curious about, okay, what's actually in here and how far off from my ideal nutrient rate or ideal nutrient mix is this? In a nursery setting, optimizing the pH is all about reducing cost, because if you make it so that the plant can absorb as much of the fertilizer that you had to buy as possible, you're a step ahead of the game. I think fertilizer cost in bonsai is not particularly problematic, I think, for most people. And so I would say if you're seeing a problem, pH could be among the things that you would want to address and potentially change. I know that Michael might have been the person who got us all started talking about this, and I remember the original blog post. And Michael's also written a book about how to be a little bit more scientific about your trees and approaching bonsai in general. I don't think it's important for us to also separate anecdotal or case studies from actual controlled experiments. So if you take one pine tree and give it acidified water and it gets really green needles because of that, that's correlation, not causation. So what you need is 125 pine trees, some of which are, so you would have to design an experiment in order to actually isolate it. I don't think that the pH for most people is going to be the most important thing for them to address. I think that getting rid of the sodium and making sure that you're giving them, the plants, an adequate amount of the right mix of nutrients is much more important.
Yeah, I know a lot of people have adjusted pH and some have had positive results, but why they're getting those results might not be why they think. And so not long after Michael had started writing about it, I checked my pH and thought, oh no, this must be terrible. Our pH is 9.5. And everyone's like, no, that's impossible. Your trees would all be dead. But the alkalinity is low. There's not much in there. And it was no problem at all for the root environment to kind of mitigate that and just kind of deal with it. It's just fertilizing with organic fertilizers radically lowered the pH and maintained a very near optimal root environment that allowed the plants to take up what they needed. That said, when I lowered the pH, I noticed everything turned green. Well, did that have anything to do with my water, or did it just mean the plants were able to do more with the fertilizer that was already on the tree? Obviously, it had a lot more to do with that. It wasn't that the water magically fixed anything, which is why it didn't permanently keep my trees green. I got a little bump when making the switch, and that was it. Ever since I had to stop using solid fertilizers and switch to liquid, and I had to stop just because animals stole it all and continue to steal it when I do that, I have learned a lot about different fertilizers. Some liquid fertilizers will lower your pH, some don't. And I've had single applications of fertilizers that turned pines and maples all a golden color. And I was realizing it actually kept the pH up super high. And I thought, well, that's totally not helpful for these species. Maybe it'd be great for the tomatoes that I'd bought it for. And so pH is often maybe not a red herring, but maybe not too far from that. And I also found that sometimes, depending on what you use to lower the pH, either you end up working with a dangerous substance or you end up dumping a whole lot of other fertilizer on there. I know when I used pH down, my pines all turned a bluish cast, and I thought, well, cool, but that's not what I'm going for. And so I stopped using that right away. But again, if I had different profile in the water, it probably wouldn't have noticed the difference.
Makes sense. Very interesting. I tend to agree with that based on what I've read as well. I think that kind of makes sense. I also agree, Eric, with your statement on really it's affecting the uptake amount. So you can solve that by adding more, and it's like, okay, I spent $40 on fertilizer instead of $25. It's like, okay, well, so it's a little bit of a non-problem for us from a bonsai perspective, in that perspective where it's like, we're not applying thousands of kilograms of fertilizer, we're applying, a quarter of a kilogram, or a little bit for the season, right? So
can I volunteer a hot take on fertilizer in bonsai?
Yeah, go for it.
Uh-oh.
That's what we're here for.
A lot of people, any sentence that begins with a lot of people, just take it with all the grains of salt. A lot of people will say, you know what, I switched to this new fertilizer and all my trees look great. And a couple things come to mind. Well, if you're switching fertilizer, that means that by definition, you're giving your trees nutrients that you weren't giving them before. So I would expect a bump, whether you're making a better, worse, or sideways move. Any change is likely going to have a difference. So there's that. But I'll also say that most people who make buying or selling recommendations on fertilizer are doing that on very narrow time frames. And that I've learned that often how you fertilized a tree the year before has more to do with the tree's current health than it does how you fertilize it that current year. And I'll have a funny story about that implicates Eric in a good way. But that's a funny one in that it actually takes years to figure out whether or not the protocol you're on is a good one. And when you start realizing, is root production what I want? Is foliage production what I want? Is disease or pest resistance what I want? All of that can connect with fertilizer, which is why a lot of the technical chemical stuff is a very helpful frame, but it's one of many frames you need to consider before making an actual recommendation about what may or may not be optimal. But I had 2 pines I'd grown from seed for about 12 years, and Eric borrowed one for a video project for about a year. He fertilized the heck out of that tree for that year. That year I was really busy. Goodness knows what I was doing, but it wasn't bonsai, and so I pretty much didn't fertilize my trees more than once or twice all year long. Eric brought the tree back, and I had both trees on my bench in January. I fertilized them both for the first 6 months of the year. Exactly the same. I decandled them both at the same time. And one tree exploded with new growth, and the other tree essentially sat there and didn't even make buds for the next 6 months. And so that's when the light bulb went off, and I thought, we might be flattering ourselves in what we think might be causing a given effect in a plant. And that's when I've started paying a lot more attention to how have I fertilized a given batch of trees over time. And since I've been paying attention to that, I've noticed more and more what a huge effect that has on overall tree health.
So, Addison, I want to add that I think something I said maybe in an email, which is the entire nursery industry has basically switched over to granular time release fertilizers, both because they don't have the solubility problems that you have when you're injecting fertilizers and because they're time release and plants love consistency. The other problem is that, by most estimates, when you're applying concentrated liquid fertilizer, the plant's only absorbing between 10 and 15% of the ions, and then most of the rest of it gets flushed out, which at scale is a large environmental problem, which becomes a regulatory problem, et cetera, et cetera. So granular time release, I find works really well in my nursery. But again, those are tree seedlings or, up to 10 years old for the most part. I think that using a granular time release fertilizer that has a complete suite of micronutrients in it as essentially a baseline for your trees is probably one of the single easiest improvements that all of us could make. You can still, put it on a low dose and then tweak nutrients as you see fit, if you see fit, or forget about it for a few months. I think there's a couple of complications. One is that I think that the companies that make this stuff routinely lie about how long it lasts, or maybe more generously or more understandingly, I should say, their estimates are based on conditions that are not the same as what I see.
They don't want to overclaim how long it lasts.
But granular time release is it's probably way better than people give it credit for.
It's almost like
Whenever
cheating.
Whenever you say granular time release, are you talking about like temperature controlled resins, like little Osmocote type prills, or is there something else that like is purely time based and not temperature controlled?
Well, I know
like
that
grades.
As of 20 years ago, there was a problem, and I don't know how much better it's gotten, but some of the first coatings that were used were too temperature sensitive. But in the nursery industry, just like in bonsai, if you have a 100-degree day and an explosion of all of those capsules, you're going to see burn on your plants. It might not be like a Japanese black pine that shows you the burn, but some people are using this on like very salt sensitive species. And so you're going to see that sort of thing. So I think over the last 20 or 25 years that there has been a great deal of improvement. That said, I don't live in a very hot area, so I can't give you actual anecdotal information about whether or not they're working just as well or whatnot.
Got it. I guess I wasn't trying. I was just curious what the mechanism is for these time-controlled fertilizers. But
my understanding is
if you give me
it's
an
both.
example of what you're talking about, I'll look into.
They're polymer coated.
How it works.
They're polymer coated.
Okay. So you're talking about the like polymer coated prills that release fertilizer over time.
Well, I don't think it's as simple as just one or the other, because depending on the temperature, the humidity, and how much rain there is, how fast are your trees drying out, how often are you watering them, and then what's the temperature when you're watering them. So while the mechanisms are temperature and or exposure to water over time, we know that more of all of that will break them down a little bit faster. But even that isn't necessarily relevant until we start hearing stories of a lot of people that are suffering that. And I do have anecdotal evidence about exactly what happens when you over-fertilize with that stuff and what kind of symptoms you can see from burn from applying way too much Osmocote Plus, just for example.
It is important. I think using it as a baseline, meaning the dose is relatively low, is, as I said, a good way to improve your overall nutrition. But if you apply too much, it's going to be a problem.
And different species will handle that overage in different ways.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think the reason I was asking was I've had some, theoretically agree with the result. I've had some problems with like temperature controlled, like those resin prills, because like they're made to operate at specific temperatures, right? Like the release rate is dependent on temperature. And so in San Francisco, if it doesn't get above 60 degrees, if they're meant to release at 70 degrees, they just don't release a lot of stuff. So you do need to be cognizant of, if it's the same product that I'm thinking of, you just need to be cognizant of the temperature in your area and the operating temperature of the actual granules.
There are many different types. Some of them are a mix of plastic coated, so prills, as you say. I didn't know that was the word. But mixed with more quickly soluble particles. So maybe they give an initial dose that's a little bit higher, and then it tapers off over time or whatnot. But there's so many of them, it's kind of hard to generalize.
And the last time I read a label, they purposefully mentioned that they had both, and that's one way they could make the pellets last as long as they had different thicknesses they had different color and different character pellets within the mix, just so they could guarantee some kind of output over some period of time, because they need to live at least somewhat up to their marketing claims.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah, it is. And so What I found with the temperature things is I haven't had trouble that I would attribute to fertilizer not doing its thing because we didn't hit a temperature. It's more like if temperatures are low, we're watering a quarter as much, and so there's no delivery. And B, the trees just don't grow when it's not hot, whether or not we're fertilizing them. And that I would say the trees not growing because of low temps will get in the way way more frequently, at least that I've seen, than the lack of fertilizer.
Not coming out.
In general, a single hot day will make trees grow in our area like in a heartbeat, whether or not we've fertilized them. And that goes for lots of species.
You guys have been excellent sports. I did want to ask Eric one more question and then give you guys a chance if you had any juicy expo knowledge for us. I'd love to hear that. But Eric, I wanted to ask you, as a grower, do you throw any of this advice on keeping it simple out the window? Like for you, do you think you need to understand the agricultural science more because you're doing this at scale and trying to optimize for, amount of growth in inches per year and things like that? Do you think you have to throw a little bit of this out of the window of the keep it simple advice, or do you think you just double down on it as a grower?
That's a good question. So I'm actually planning like a nutrient experiment so that I can isolate different symptoms and document them for particular species. But that is definitely an outlier in terms of the actual operation. I find that the plants, as I advocated, react best to a consistent fertilizer regimen because day in and day out, they're making little incremental growth. So when you're in a nursery operation and you're trying to just get them to grow as much as possible, I'm not really trying to slow them down like you would as mature bonsai, or for the most part anyway. So I'm not tweaking nutrients very much. I basically have one granular time release and one soluble fertilizer that I use in the nursery, and that's pretty much it. If I see a block of trees that appear to have some sort of nutrient deficiency that I can identify, then I might apply like a CalMag or something else. But in general, I don't.
Very cool. Yeah, I would love to hear more about or see the results of your nutrient experiment whenever that comes out too. That sounds really fascinating.
It's also funny to see when walking around different nurseries, is the problem fertilization in one corner of the field, or that maybe that corner of the field didn't get repotted as much? And so like bad soil can mask fertilizer problems or vice versa. And so depending on, which garden or nursery you're in, it's like under fertilization and bad soil cause a lot more problems than water in a lot of places, for instance.
So now we're going to part 3 of the episode on soil science. No, I'm just kidding.
In other words, new in Expo news. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would love to hear from you guys if you have any tidbits to drop to us. I'm very anxiously awaiting the next Expo, but would love to hear what's top of mind for you all regarding it.
I'm going to say that we are super excited to start getting submissions and to start, making more announcements and whatnot. But we're also super excited that we didn't actually have to get any of the submissions until the fall this time, instead of having to get them like an entire growing season in advance. And I think that the trees are going to be better for it, and it's less work for everybody to try to so the proximity of the submission period to the actual show is much closer, and I think that's great.
I think we've also we found that our marketing and planning has really followed from that, whereas when we needed to generate the buzz to get the submission so far in advance, that meant all of our marketing had to be in place, all these other things had to be in place. But now that we know that that's coming so much later, we've focused on and actually made a far more strategic calendar of what to focus on at what points of the year. So as of right now, we've sold out. Probably 3/4 of our vendor space is spoken for already, and
You gave me a little bit of a heart attack there. I thought the tickets to the event were already sold out.
Tickets will be on sale somewhere like September 1st is like on our plan. We'll see if that changes or not, but we're targeting much further down the road before we get to the ticket sales. But we've been working on the budget. We've been working on the back-end systems, all the boring scoring and submission and vendoring and communication. We've been doing all kinds of work on that, and that produces far fewer interesting assets to share. But the juicy stuff's going to start coming, hopefully pretty darn soon.
When does the submission submissions open soon, right?
October 15th to November 15th. So it's not until October.
Okay. Wow.
So that lets us focus on infrastructure planning and the basics of the event right now. And the vendors need to make plans for next year. And that's why we lead with that. And then we want to make sure that people are there. So we have our official hotel in place. The information's on the website. The plan your trip information is all up to date on the website. So we got that far in place. Next will be the ticket sales again in late summer, early fall. After that, there's going to be a massive ramp up for the submissions. And then we're going to crank through the jury process and final ticket sales as we lead up into the event. Our first winter event in February.
Woo. Yeah, be there or be square. That's the message to the viewers here, listeners,
and
I guess.
The venue is even larger than the second venue, so we keep doubling it. I don't think we can do that anymore, but it's quite a bit bigger. So we don't anticipate. I don't know. I think anybody who wants to come is going to be able to come.
And there will be lots of parking.
Lots of parking.
On-site parking.
Probably a little bit safer parking than Oakland too.
We've got all kinds of new things we're working on for the event, and so hopefully we'll be able to start sharing the more juicy tidbits
Is
as
there
it gets planned.
any tidbits you can kind of tease out there, or things are still in the works?
Well, the boring thing to announce is that we are going to do a day of programs just like last time. So it looks like we'll do Sunday presentations just like we did last time, with a combination of demonstrations and or talks and or presentations of some sort. And we also another thing we can mention is that we have a number of vendors who have expressed interest in coming from Japan, a similar number to last time.
Oh, no way.
So we had, I think, 3 last time, and I think all 3 of them are at least tentatively making plans. When I got to Kokofu in February, and one of those vendors sat down and started showing me pictures of how much fun he had in California and said, "Where's Pleasanton?" And so then I knew we were off to a good start.
Oh, that's awesome.
That was
I'm really
12
excited
months
to
ahead
see
of the
them
event. The
again.
guy's asking me in Tokyo where Pleasanton is.
That's awesome.
It was pretty great.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you guys coming on the show. It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure speaking with you about bonsai and kind of soaking up all the accumulated knowledge. So thank you so much for taking the time. And yeah, I really appreciate it and hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you guys.